Barb and I have really enjoyed our time with you thus far this weekend, and I also want to thank you as a congregation for sharing Todd and Kim with us last weekend in our ordination. And yes, we would like to, maybe I shouldn't even say this on a Sunday morning, but we'd like to borrow him some more as time goes on. We'll see what the Lord works out there. I brought along some books that you're welcome to help yourself to. They're on the right-hand side as you go out of the auditorium under the coat hangers there. And the one is the How to Find Purpose in Life, which we wrote quite a few years ago, basically on our growth as Christians as we walk with the Lord. And then later on I wrote a book on I Will Build My Church. That's back there also. And then most recently, a book with 52 projects for you to invest in your local church. It's called Being the Blessing, as you bless those around you in the congregation and building our local congregations. So those books are back there. You're welcome to pick them up if they happen to be all. There's somewhere underneath, in a box underneath, so feel free to pick those up if you would like to. There's also some calendars there for women to pray for their family and children and other associations, so feel free to pick those up. This morning I'd like to talk about what are the characteristics of a church. What should be the characteristics of a church? Where do we find our model? Where is Northwoods looking to? What group or what situation is Northwoods looking to kind of be your mentor as a church, as a brotherhood? Who are you trying to copy as you gather together? When was the church at her best historically? So the model church we'd like to discuss this morning. From what era do we have the best embodiment of what God intended church life to be like? When was it the strongest? When does it best illustrate the brotherhood? When was it at its zenith? Was it the Chinese church under the Boxer Rebellion when the missionaries all had to leave and the Chinese church was very young and they didn't think it was going to even survive, and yet 50 years later it had multiplied, I think something like 50 times. It just grew under that persecution. Is that the model that Northwood should follow? Or is it the Anabaptist Church of the Reformation? Is that the one that we should go back to and say, well, they had a good understanding of what it means to be a church, and so let's follow them? Or was it the early church? Or was it the apostolic church, the one we read about in the New Testament? If you were to pick an era of the church to be your mentor as a congregation, when would it be? The traditional church from the Dark Ages would have said that the church came to its zenith under Constantine. That's when the church really came of age and was at its zenith. It was a union of the masses of those who called themselves Christians. There was a wedding between the church and the state. And even though it had some embarrassing moments here and there, they would say that was the zenith. That was the best. The Reformation leaders were a little bit divided on that, but Martin Luther would have said that the Constantine's time was the summertime of faith. That's what he called it, the summertime of faith. Our Anabaptist forefathers saw the impact of Constantine as the fall of the church. It wasn't the summertime, and it wasn't the fall in relation to seasons, but it was the falling away of the church. So there's kind of a direct controversy there as to is it the summertime or the apostasy of the church. What was the golden age of the church? We'd like to look at that for a little bit this morning and see what the characteristics were of a church that I'd like to suggest is our model. But before we do that, let's again share together on this. Let's stand together and say our theme verse. We'll say it twice this morning. But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him. But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him. All right, you may be seated. So, these other traditions of church history, Christian history, would have said that the church in the book of Acts and immediately thereafter, they would have used two terms primarily to describe the church at that time. They said the church was infant, or they used the word primitive. You've heard those words, the primitive church or the infant church. Generally, writers who refer to the church as infant or primitive are talking about the church back in the book of Acts and the first several hundred years right after that. Primitive and infant. Now, what do those terms imply? Infant doesn't really sound like any maturity, right? That's kind of the opposite of maturity. Just beginning. Lots of things to learn. They are not developed. They're still growing. That's a word that says something about our understanding of who the church should be when we use the word infant. Or if we use the word primitive. What does that imply? Well, when we think, especially in secular history, about primitive, we think about people living in caves and eating their food cooked over an open fire out in front of the cave someplace, dressed in animal skins. That's primitive. Does that fit what we're talking about in relation to the church? But these are the two terms that are used most often by theologians and so forth as they refer to the first church. My question is, did God leave the best example of what the bride is to be to some nebulous, debatable time after the book of Acts? So we don't really know how we're supposed to follow or who we're supposed to follow. Did God do that? Harold Littell said, either the message and example of the New Testament are taken to be a binding norm, or they are considered to be historically undeveloped beginning patterns which later had to be altered. I don't know which side of that controversy there you would understand to be right this morning. I hope it's the one side. But that's really what we're up against. Where's our model? Where's our example? Who is our mentor? Acts is debated by some as, is it descriptive or prescriptive? The book of Acts. And I'm not here to really develop that argument at all this morning. In fact, I'm not exactly sure that I have a good answer for some of the questions that might be raised by that question. Is it descriptive? Is it just recording what they did back there and kind of letting us know what was going on? Or is it prescriptive in that what they did we should follow? That's the question. Some people say it was descriptive, and so you don't really have to follow it in all its details because it was just telling us what was going on. Other people would say, well, no, it was prescriptive, and so we follow it because it's the example that we need to follow. And again, what I share this morning, I'm not trying to make a real strong statement one way or the other, but I do believe that there were at least 4 activities, 4 things that were prescriptive and descriptive. They were both. And I would like to spend a little time on that this morning. Now, what characterizes our church activities? What characterizes Northwood's activities? If somebody were to come in and observe what's going on for a month or two, and they would write out 4, 5, 6 different things that seem to be characteristic of Northwood's Mennonite Church, what would they write down? What would be on their list? I went to one church in the South a number of years ago, and they got up to make their announcements for the Sunday morning. And please don't go back and critique your own announcements this morning, all right? But somebody got up and gave the announcement. The first announcement was that there was going to be a bake sale on a certain day coming up. The second announcement was they were going to have an auction to raise money for their school. The third announcement was they're going to have a golf fellowship another Saturday or so in the future. And the fourth announcement was that they were going to have a 5K marathon run scheduled at a later time. The fifth announcement then was that they're going to have a covenant meeting. So I thought it was kind of interesting. Out of 5 announcements, 80% of them had to do with sports and making or getting money, income. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily characterized that church. It was just interesting that on that Sunday morning, that's what we were focusing on in the announcements. What 4 things characterized us? In David Berceau's book, Will the Real Heretic Please Stand Up? He notes that one pagan antagonist who was critiquing the Christians noted that there were 6 things that he saw about the Christians. The one was that they despise honors. They don't like purple robes. The second thing was that they abstain from all respectable pleasures, respectable in this pagan's mind at least. He noticed that about them. The third thing is that he noticed they didn't attend any sporting events. And the fourth thing was that they had no interest in public amusements. And the fifth thing was that they rejected all public banquets. And the last thing was that they abhorred all the, in quotes, sacred games. So that was 5 or 6 things that this antagonist noted about the Christians. Kind of interesting. What should our churches be characterized by? Well, we could list some things. We have prayer meeting. We spend time in prayer. We have times of fellowship in certain days or certain parts and times of the week or month or even year. We have Bible preaching. We have Bible study. Maybe we have kids clubs where we invite neighborhood children. We have vacation Bible schools, which you're working on. We have maybe some volunteers that go to the pregnancy center to help in saving lives from abortion. Maybe we have some of us in college speaking out in classes that are anti-Christian or at least atheistic. Maybe you have projects with taking care of the poor or the widows in your community. I don't know what Northwood has. Those might be some of the things that would characterize your church. But I'd like to look at the 4 this morning that are listed about the church in Jerusalem back in the time of the apostles. Just 3 verses that we're going to kind of focus on this morning. Acts chapter 2, verses 40, 41, and 42. It says, "And with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, Save yourselves from this untoward generation." That was the end of the message. And then it says in verse 41, "Then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls." We have something really dynamic happening here with 3,000 people. You'd have a little trouble getting all these people in your church if there was that many within the next week or so. There's a lot of people coming in, and so they had this challenge. But what's interesting to me is the next verse tells us what was characteristic of this group of people. It gives us 4 things. It says they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and in fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and prayer. Let's look at those 4 things that characterize the early church. And I think their example is intended to, in a sense, mentor us in these areas. We might debate about some other things. I know there's some people who say, ordinations should not be by lot. That was just descriptive. And other people say, no, ordinations by lot was prescriptive. And it's found there in the book of Acts. And I'll let you debate that amongst yourselves. You probably have people on both sides in a group this size on that issue. Or the whole thing of communal living. They had more of a communal style of living back there. Was that prescriptive or was that descriptive? You talk to the Hutterites, they'd say, no, that was prescriptive. You talk to the Mennonites, no, that was descriptive. So there's a lot of those but here, I think we can all agree, these 4 things are both descriptive and prescriptive. They give us a model of what should be important in our church life. Let's look at, before we do that, one comment here again by David Berceau. Interesting, and he's a historian, and he's done a lot of work in the early church era and the writings of the people right immediately after the New Testament. And he says, for 2.5 centuries, Christianity remained relatively unchanged. That's about 250 years. It remained relatively unchanged in their doctrine, their practice, and so forth. In the past, any new doctrine or practice had been automatically rejected by the church. But after Constantine's conversion, that was about 324 or somewhere in there, the church began to re-examine its attitude that change was necessarily wrong. The church no longer equated change with error. Rather, the church began believing that Christianity could change for the better. Perhaps apostolic Christianity wasn't the pinnacle of Christianity, but only the beginning. And so we begin to have major changes happening from that point on in the church. Now we've come down to our age, and we have all kinds of new innovations which we say, oh, these are effective, these are good, these are better methods for our church. Like I'm probably going to tread on some toes here, I don't know, I'm going to take the chance. We think, well, now we can raise money by benefit auctions. Just get stuff out here in front, and everybody's bidding on it. And it's going to a good thing. It's going to this ministry or that ministry. I'm not here to say that's necessarily wrong, but it's interesting that you don't see anything in the New Testament about having benefit auctions. So we use that as kind of, this is a new thing that we can add to that helps our ministry. Or we have worship teams. Get this team up here with the drums and the cymbals and the bass guitars and so forth, and that can really get us revved up. And so that's something we need to add to. I noticed you didn't have that, so that's probably not a problem here. But some of our churches across America think that that's the way. Or Christian jewelry, that way we can identify that we're Christians by this cross that hangs around our neck, or maybe even we get a new tattoo that has that on there. The different ways that the church is saying we can do a better job and we can evangelize. We have sports evangelism. Get a bunch of people together, play a hard game of basketball, football, whatever, and be sure to beat them, though, because if you don't beat them, then your gospel is a little bit weak because you haven't been able to beat the other team. And so be sure to get a good group of players so you can beat them. We don't want to make a church, we just have this great speaker or great ideas that are charismatic leaders, and just keep drawing them in. It doesn't really, we know that the individual is going to kind of get lost in the mass, but Jesus had 5,000 people listening to him there at one time, and so mega church. That's the way we should do. We should go. Televangelists, or these popular evangelists, whose personal lives, we don't really know about them, but they're doing such a good job that it doesn't really matter if they aren't watched or seen or accountable. And unfortunately, we had one of the most disappointing things that happened in that realm here just recently. There was a man who was probably one of the top 5 apologists for Christianity in the world. His life was shown to be a hypocritical life. So these new innovations, are they good? Are they really helpful? Maybe we should go back and see what the other church did. What was important to them? We don't have, we have the idea that we have a lot of things that we could help with church evangelism that have grown over the years and come up, and so these are better ways of doing things. And it's too bad the New Testament church didn't have all our catchy ideas. The first thing that it says the New Testament church had was the apostles' doctrine. The apostles' doctrine. It precedes these 4 things with a word that means continued steadfastly. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and these other 3. What that word means is to be earnest toward a thing, to persevere, be constantly diligent, to attend assiduously all the exercises, or to adhere closely to. What does it take to keep you home? What keeps you away from the brotherhood? What does it take to keep you home? It says they were continually, steadfastly together. To earnestly be toward something. And the first thing that they mention is the apostles' doctrine. I think of the pregnant lady in Papua New Guinea who was hearing, her and her whole tribe were hearing the gospel for the first time. And as they were building up the story day after day, they came to the last day when they were ready to give the account of Jesus' death and his resurrection, and had built up this story that the natives have never heard before. And the entire village is coming out to listen. One lady was pregnant, right ready to deliver her child, when they're going to give this last message. And she isn't going to stay home. So she comes to the service, gets behind some bushes, and while they're giving that last message, she gives birth to a baby back there. She's not going to miss. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending that for all of you, but I'm just saying there was something very important about being together for the apostles' doctrine that was being taught, and she wasn't going to miss out. Bible study was something that touched what was deeply converted in them, and they wanted more of it. They were hungry for it. They became convinced of their sin. They became convinced of their righteousness, and they became convinced of judgment. And that's what they wanted to talk about. The church has to be built around this. I think that's why it's named first, because it was so important. It's not our revival meetings, it's not our camps, it's not our youth rallies, it's not our seminars, it's not our styles of worship that are really foundational to becoming like the New Testament church. It's the apostles' doctrine that is so very important. Something deep within them was hungering and thirsting. They were discovering the joy of what it meant to be a saint, and they wanted more and more of it. When people don't hunger, they will live shallowly on the surface. Unless there is a desperation for holiness, we will go on in complacency. That desperation diminishes our talk about all the things that we often do talk about, our occupations, our hobbies, our sports. And that's where that one verse in this song, things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. So this morning in our Sunday school time, we're talking about eating of Christ's flesh. And he says, the words that I give to you, they are spirit and they are life. We must eat of his words, eat of his being, eat of his doing in order to have life. How do we eat of his words? How do we eat him, as it were? Put him into our whole spiritual digestive system and grow in that. I struggle at times with the radical ways that Jesus calls us to live. Even as Anabaptists, you're living pretty radically different than most of the people around your community, but it seems like what Jesus calls us to as we hunger and thirst after righteousness is a radical thing that's maybe even radical in our circles. He says, give to him who asks of you and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. I wonder how many times I've pushed that aside and said, oh, Lord, I can't do it now. I walk down the streets of Chiang Mai, and there's beggars all along the street. Lord, I can't give them all money. Must not mean what you're saying it means here in that context. I struggle to eat of Jesus' meat at that point. Do good to them that hate you. Do I have to? They're not going to receive it anyway. They're just going to make a story out of it and interpret it a different way, so I'd rather just kind of forget it. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth. But Lord, my ability to make income is decreasing. You sure I shouldn't have something there in the bank account? Narrow is the way, and few there be that find it. It's not something that we just walk into by accident. We don't just walk into it because of culture. We don't just walk into it because our parents were Christian. It says, few there be that search after it and actually find it. If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out. What does that mean? That's pretty radical. How many of us have seen somebody walking around with only one eye because the other one was plucked out because they wanted to overcome the adultery that was talked about in the verse before? What God says, what Christ says that we are to live and will find life in is radical. Very radical. Now, it might not mean you cutting out your eye, but it might mean you get rid of your cell phone. And you don't have a cell phone any longer. So you can't get access to those. You know, and some people, I hear them talking about this, and they say, well, I'm still struggling, or such and such a person still struggling with pornography or whatever. This is to be so drastic that there's no opportunity. You cut out your eye. Whatever that means, getting rid of cell phones, getting an accountability group, having people calling you, you do everything, drastic things to get this thing stopped. That's what Jesus is saying. The apostles' doctrine, they enjoyed Bible study. They radically applied Christ's teaching. I'm a little biased in this, but I think that somehow New Testament church life was somewhere between our normal lives that we live today and the life of a Bible school student. Somewhere in between there. I'm not sure exactly where. But they were together assiduously in prayer, in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, prayer, and breaking of bread. Well, that happens pretty often in the Bible school setting, maybe for our young people. Somewhere in between that and what tends to be normality for us is probably closer to what the New Testament church experienced. The apostles' doctrine was just very, very important to them. We could spend more time on that, but my time is running out. Let's go on to fellowship as the second one. That word comes from the Greek word koinonia, which means partnership, social intercourse, or pecuniary benefaction. How many of you students know what the formula for water is? The chemical formula. You know what what is it? Okay, it's give me the details there. It's hydrogen and oxygen. How many hydrogen to how many oxygen? H2O, right? 2 hydrogen for every 1 oxygen. Do you know what the chemical formula for fellowship is? Anybody know what that is? Well, I'm not sure this is in your science books. It probably is not there, but I think it's E6R. Okay, remember that, E6R. We'll talk about that more this evening. E6R, that means that in fellowship you have 6 encouragements for every 1 reproof. Okay, E6R, 6 encouragements for every 1 reproof. That works across the board. It works with your children. It works with the people you work with in your job. It works in the brotherhood. A minimum of 6 encouragements for every reproof. If you don't have that kind of balance, then what's going to happen is that you have people who don't want to see you because they just know when you come around, you're going to get a reproof. If we can relish what God has done in them and bless them with 6 encouragements, then when you come with a reproof for something that you want to help them overcome, they're going to be listening because they know that that's not the norm of the way you respond to them. We'll develop that more later on. Fellowship is what happens between your brain, your heart, and your lungs to keep you alive. Okay, there's got to be a syncretism between them. If the lungs are running low in air, the heart and brain are going to be directly affected by that. So fellowship is a setting where it feels safe to explore the struggle that I have with temptation. And sometimes people don't come to our churches to do that. They go to a counselor's office. But God intended the brotherhood to be the place where we find that kind of help. Sharing our conversion experience, sharing what God is sanctifying in me right now, sharing our hope for the future, sharing even our courtship marriage stories, sharing our testimony. Recently, our brother right across the road lost his wife. Jen Stauffer went to be with the Lord. And all of a sudden, there's a new level of interaction that Barb and I have been able to have with Johnny because we've experienced what he's going through. And that's what we're talking about in fellowship. We walk with each other in the experiences of life that we can share, that the comfort wherewith you've been comforted, you can use to comfort others. That's fellowship. We use our money to make friends. Luke chapter 16, if there's anything, we can kind of struggle with, is that a good steward or is he a bad steward? One place he's called a shrewd servant, another one an unjust servant. He takes his master's money, or he's going to get fired, so he goes to these different people and he lessens their debt. So I don't know for sure what all the implications of that story is. But one thing is clear that comes from that story, and that is he was commended because he used unrighteous mammon to make friends. And brothers and sisters, that's something your pocketbook should do. I don't know how you want to do it or how the Holy Spirit is going to guide you to do that. But where you use the finances God has given you to make friends, to warm the soil of salvation for someone out there. Not just within your group. You take care of each other, and that's part of what fellowship means, is taking care of each other's needs. But that thing of making friends with unrighteous mammon. Don't depend on Sunday morning for your primary spiritual interaction with brethren. This isn't it isn't even necessarily the best time. It's a good time, but it's not necessarily the best time for developing fellowship between brothers and sisters. Just as an encouragement, the one booklet back there, Being the Blessing, it has 52 activities that you can do, one a week for the next year, to invest in your brotherhood. So pick one of those up, and if that can be a help to give some ideas. I really believe that the eye of Christ is upon the bride of Jesus Christ, and that's who you are. So that's where we should invest our time and our efforts. Church fellowship was the focus of their social life, and any contact with the world was evangelism, but their contact within the church was fellowship. In their book, Total Church, Chester and Timnis said, in our experience, people often are attracted to the Christian community before they are attracted to the Christian message. You get what he's saying? They're attracted to the Christian community before they're attracted to the Christian message. There's something in our lives, in interacting with them, that draws them. And fellowship is an atmosphere of discovery, an atmosphere of safety, of loyalty, of permanence, and of unity. And again, I wish we had more time to spend on that, but we will maybe touch on it again this evening. What are some factors that quench fellowship? And here we could spend an entire message just on these, but I'd just like to throw out 4 things. Surface relationships. If we never get below the surface in our relationships with each other about our own struggles, some of us would like to and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody, we want to give that I've been successful, I'm going in the right direction. I have a hard time talking about what's going on in here that's not quite where it should be. So relationships stay on the surface. They don't go down into where we're really struggling or what God is trying to grow in us. The underlying lie that causes this is that to know me casually is to like me. To know me deeply is to reject me. And if we believe that, we'll live on the surface. We enjoy the topsoil discussions. The subsoil is too dirty. Don't want to get into it. The second problem for fellowship is our temporary relationships. We seldom open up to a passing friend. It's somebody we feel is going to be around, or we can continue to relate to them. Many people hold a pending divorce paper over their church. If this church crosses this line, I'm out of here. We won't have fellowship if that's our mentality. If we portray that we can do without each other, we often do. If we only remain till trouble doth us part, our commitment to the brotherhood is like the world's commitment to marriage. The third thing is resistance to certain biblical teachings. One writer was driving down through Lancashire County, went past a 3-stall garage, and in the first stall he noticed that there was a horse and buggy parked in there. In the second stall he saw there was a dark blue Caprice, late model Caprice, Chevrolet, sitting in the second one. In the third stall there was a bright red Corvette. And his observation was that something was not being passed on. The apostasy in relation to biblical teaching. I must rush on. The viper of occupational pursuits, again, don't have much time to talk about this. It's so easy for us to talk about occupation rather than Scripture. Fellowship. 1 John 3, hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That's the foundation of our commitment to each other that takes us to the deeper things in the Christian life. We've got about 5 minutes here for the last 2. So you're going to get the high speed one here. Breaking of bread, there's the 2 things, communion, and again, we could spend a whole evening on that. That's probably the primary thing here. And I think communion opens a whole new perspective when we begin to understand how that was Christ's proposal to the church. He was paying the bridal price at that moment. And so whenever we have communion, we are remembering that as a part of communion. The other thing is that they just had fellowship meals. When the 2 disciples were walking to Emmaus and Jesus caught up with them, they went in and they broke bread, it says there. So they used the same idea. So these were very typical of the early church as they related to each other. We have opportunities to invite people into our homes. As they see the inside of your home, they're going to see a little bit more of the inside of your heart, what you stand for. In the first century church, it appears that hospitality was used as the primary method of church evangelism. Many of the people around your community, like around our community, are scared to walk into your church. You are a bunch of weird people. Peculiar is the New Testament word. And so they're not sure about joining you. But they will come to your home if you invite them. Or if you take them out for a meal, spending that money for unrighteous mammon to build friends, you can in those settings. And so Eric Wallace says that the first century church appears that hospitality was the primary method of reaching people. The last characteristic of the early church was prayer. We can pray best with the man with whom we played best, or we worked with best. The man beside us in church should not be a holy stranger, but a living brother, sister, in the case of you ladies. The Church of Acts is our model. They had an hour of prayer every day. I don't know how they did that. How would we do that in our schedules today? It appears that hour of prayer was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So they sacrificed something as it involved their occupations to be together in prayer. Did that relate to their power in any way? How did the employers, the employees, and shopkeepers, and carpenters, and farmers, and herdsmen, and so forth in the New Testament take that time off each day? Leonard Ravenhill, in his book, Revival God's Ways, says, let 20% of the choir turn up for rehearsal and the choir director is offended. Let 20% of the church membership turn out for prayer meeting and the pastor's elated. Something's upside down. Something's backward. We're going to skip this to go to our verse again and then we'll have a song in closing. Let's stand together. Together. But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him. I love thy kingdom, Lord, the house of thine abode.